Welcome to Unit 5. The main topic for Unit 5 is cryptographic protocols. We're going to look at ways to use the things that we've seen in the previous 4 units to solve problems. So we'll be using symmetric encryption, we'll be using cryptographic hash functions, and we'll be using asymmetric encryption to solve problems. And the main problem we're going to solve is how to authenticate between a client and a server. Anytime we talk about cryptographic protocols, we have to think about what our threat model is. If we want to argue that a protocol is secure, we need to understand the threat model, which means knowing the capabilities of the adversary. In order to argue the protocol is secure, we need to argue that an adversary with only those capabilities will not be able to break the protocol. So what are the kinds of things we need to assume? So the first main assumption is that the adversary has limited computational power. And that generally means that we're assuming that our encryption primitives work. An attacker who intercepts a message encrypted with some key K is not able to decrypt it unless they know K or have some other advantage for decrypting that message. We also assume that hash functions have the properties they should, that it's pre-image resistant, so an adversary who has the hash of X cannot figure out what X was, and that they also have strong collision resistance, that an adversary can't find two values that hash to the same output. We might also make assumptions about what the attacker can do to the network. If the attacker is passive, that would mean that they can only eavesdrop. They can listen in on messages on the network, but they can't modify them, and they can't inject their own messages into the network. A more powerful adversary would be an active attacker. An active attacker controls the network. They can modify data and messages. They can replay messages. That means they can record messages on the network, and then at some later time, replay a message that they heard previously. They can also do attacks like we saw against Diffie-Hellman, where they act as a middleman, intercepting traffic between two parties and replacing it with their own traffic. So let's have a quiz to see if you understand threat models. Which of these threat models would be a good model for an adversary who controls a router on the internet? The answer is this would be an attacker who has limited computational power, but does have active capabilities. Since they control the network, they can modify messages going through that router, they could replay messages, they could act as a middle attacker. They have lots of things they can do other than just intercept and try to analyze intercepted messages. And for most of what we're going to do, we're going to assume this threat model. We're going to assume an attacker who does have limited computational power. That means we'll assume that encryption and hash functions work the way they're supposed to. Certainly that's not always true, that they could have weaknesses that an attacker could exploit. But when we design protocols, we usually don't need to pick a particular encryption algorithm. We're going to assume that we have one that either is a symmetric or an asymmetric encryption function that has the properties it should have. And we're going to assume the attacker's active, that they can intercept messages, they can try to analyze what they hear, but they can also modify messages and replay messages and do anything they could do to disrupt the protocol by changing things on the network. So that's the main threat model that our protocols are designed to resist. So what we're going to do the rest of this unit is look at 3 particular protocols. We're going to look at the encrypted key exchange protocol. We're going to look at SSH for setting up a secure shell. And we'll look at TLS, which is the most widely used cryptographic protocol today. That's the protocol that's used every time someone connects to a secure website using HTTPS. All of these have some things in common. They all have the goal of authenticating a client and a server. This could be in either direction or in both directions. It could be to allow a client to know that they're talking to the right server. It could be to allow a server to know that they're talking to the right client. It could be to mutually authenticate both parties. And they all involve a mix of asymmetric and symmetric techniques. What I hope you get from seeing the 3 different protocols is a sense of some of the things that are the same, that they're techniques that all the protocols have in common at some level, but there are also differences between the protocols, the things that led to those decisions, and why the protocols have different properties. We'll start by talking about encrypted key exchange. The idea for this protocol comes from Steve Bellovin and Michael Merritt back in 1992. There have been many, many variations on this protocol, many of which are still in use today. And this protocol starts from Diffie-Hellman, which you should remember from Unit 3, where each party starts. They've agreed on the generator and some modulus. The client picks a random XA value, raises g to that power, sends the result to the server. The server picks a random XB value, raises g to that power, and sends the result to the client. They can both now compute the same key by raising the value they received to the power of their random value. The problem with Diffie-Hellman for authentication is if there's an active attacker, that attacker can change the values, send something different, set up a shared key independently with each party, and act as a middle attacker, intercepting all the traffic because the attacker knows the keys on these two separate channels. The idea of encrypted key exchange is to combine this with symmetric encryption to allow the client and server to authenticate each other even if there's a middle attacker. Here's how it works. So assume there's some password that at the beginning of the protocol is known to both the client and the server. Then the way this protocol works, the message that the client will send to the server, instead of just being the message that would be sent in Diffie-Hellman, is now that message encrypted using the password. So this is symmetric encryption using P. The message that would have been the message in the Diffie-Hellman protocol. And in addition to that, we also need to send the name of the client. So let's say that's Alice. When the server receives this, it can decrypt it. It knows this password, and so it obtains the value that would have been sent in the Diffie-Hellman protocol. That means it can compute a key using its secret value XB, combining that with the decrypted result here. As in the Diffie-Hellman protocol, it also sends a message back to the client. In Diffie-Hellman, that would just be G to the XB, mod Q, where XB is the secret value selected by the server. Now we're going to combine that with symmetric encryption, encrypting that with the password. Alice decrypts that message, so she can also obtain the value here and obtain the key using the normal Diffie-Hellman technique. So now we'll have a quiz to see if you understand the EKE protocol. The question is, which of these are drawbacks of using the protocol as we've described it here? To authenticate a user, that would be Alice on this side, to a website, that would be the server on this side. So the first possibility is that it's vulnerable to offline dictionary attacks. This is where an attacker goes through a dictionary of common passwords, trying to guess the password of a user. The second choice is that it requires servers to store the passwords in clear text. And as we discussed in Unit 2, this is never a good idea. The third choice is it's vulnerable to meet-in-the-middle attacks, just like the Diffie-Hellman protocol was. The answer is only the second one is true. So the first answer is not true. In fact, the EKE protocol is designed primarily with this goal of not being vulnerable to offline dictionary attacks. And the reason for that is if you look at the two messages that are sent, the value that's encrypted with a password is the result of a Diffie-Hellman exponentiation. If we believe the Diffie-Hellman assumption, that's indistinguishable from random. An attacker who intercepts these messages could try all possible passwords in the dictionary. Even if one of those is correct, the attacker couldn't tell which. The attacker obtains the encrypted messages, which are these Diffie-Hellman exponentials. From those, there's no way to obtain the key, so there's no way to know if the guess was correct, and it should be indistinguishable from any other guess. So that's a good property. It also satisfies this other property, that it is actually not vulnerable to the meet-in-the-middle attack that Diffie-Hellman was vulnerable to. Because in this case, if the attacker tries to relay something without knowing the password, that will lead to some other key being computed, not known to the attacker, and the attacker won't be able to set up the middle attack. The main drawback of this protocol is it does require the server to keep the password. In order to decrypt this message encrypted with the password, the server needs to use the password to do decryption. So this means the server would need to store all the passwords in clear text. This is highly undesirable. If the server was compromised, all the passwords would be lost. I have another question about this protocol. So the way that I've described it here, does it actually provide authentication? The possible answers are no, neither party is authenticated to the other one. Yes, that it authenticates the client to the server, but not the server to the client. Yes, it authenticates the server to the client, but not the client to the server. Or yes, it authenticates both parties to each other. The answer is actually no. We haven't done enough yet to provide authentication. And as I've described it, it's not the full EKE protocol. The reason that it's not is the way to authenticate depends on proving that you have the same key. To authenticate, what Alice needs to prove to the server is that it knows the password P, and the server needs to prove to Alice that it knows that password P. Our assumption is that the password is shared between the client and the server, in this case Alice and the server, and the way to authenticate is to prove knowledge of that password. In this case, that's not done, that we've just established a key. That doesn't prove anything. This message could have been anything. The fact that Alice can decrypt it using the password doesn't prove that Bob knew the password. To do that, we need to add an extra challenge to this. What we want to prove is that both parties obtain the same key. For the server to obtain the key, it needed to be able to decrypt this message using the password. And so what we're going to add to the message is, instead of just sending this value, we're going to also send a challenge. And that challenge is going to be encrypted using the key. And the challenge is just some random value selected by the server. And now Alice needs to be able to obtain the right key. That proves that she knew the password. And using that key, well, she can decrypt this message and obtain R. This effectively demonstrates to Alice that she's talking to the right server, at least a server that knew her password, because the key that's produced here could only be produced correctly if the server was able to decrypt the message that Alice sent, encrypted with that password. This hasn't yet proven anything to the server, so to finish the protocol, Alice has to send a response back to the server that proves that she was able to obtain R. So Alice could do this by proving that she learned R, so she could send the message, encrypting with the key, R back to the server. So does this work? So the answer is no, this doesn't quite work. And the reason it doesn't work is, well, this message encrypting R with a key, that's exactly what the server sent. So this certainly doesn't prove knowledge of K, because this could just be reflected back to the server. So we need to do something a little different. Instead of encrypting just R, we need to encrypt something else that proves knowledge of K and R, but couldn't be generated just by replaying this. And so one way to do that would be to add another nonce. We're going to concatenate a new nonce here and encrypt the concatenation of those two. Now the server can decrypt this, extract R, check that it matches, and extract that value, and the server could send that value back encrypted with K. At this stage, both the server and the client have proved knowledge of the password. They've established a shared secret that they can use for further communication. And they've done this in a way so that even if there's an active attacker intercepting and modifying all these messages, if the attacker doesn't know the password P, they can't trick the client and server into believing that they're talking with each other or establishing a key that's different from the one that they would establish. The next protocol I'm going to talk about is SSH, which is the Secure Shell Protocol. The problem SSH is trying to solve is also a client-server authentication problem, that we have a client who wants to log into a server, and to log into the server asks for the password, and the client enters it. What we want to know is that when a client's connecting to a server, that they're connecting to the server they think they are, and that an attacker who can intercept and modify this traffic won't be able to trick the user into giving its password to a different server or thinking it's interacting with a different server. This protocol is also based on Diffie-Hellman and uses aspects of both symmetric and asymmetric cryptography. So the first step is very similar to Diffie-Hellman. In fact, it's the same. The client picks a large random number and sends to the server g to that power mod p. And g is the generator, p is the modulus, just like in Diffie-Hellman. The server picks its own large random value, we'll call that xs, and computes ys, which is g raised to that power. So far this is the same as the Diffie-Hellman protocol. And then the server computes the key, which is yc, the value transmitted here, raised to the xs power. So far this is all the same as what's done in Diffie-Hellman. Just change the names of the variables to match the client and server. The next step is where things get interesting. What the server will compute is a hash, so it will use some cryptographic hash function. And the inputs to that hash function, first there will be some parameters that identify the protocol. Those will be concatenated with the public key of the server. We're assuming at the start of the protocol the server has some public-private key pair. And so what will be included in this hash is that public key of the server, the value of yc that was sent by the client. That verifies that it's part of the same session, prevents replay attacks because now that value was determined by the client. The value of ys, this is the normal Diffie-Hellman response, and the key. Note that this is all in a one-way hash, so someone who intercepts that hash won't be able to learn anything about the inputs. Someone who knows the inputs would be able to verify that the hash is correct. And so what the server sends is the value of its public key, the value of ys, and the hash signed with the server's private key. So we think of that as sending the hash along with the hash encrypted with a private key. That's what it means to do a signature in a symmetric crypto system. So for this quiz, I want to see that you understand the SSH protocol. At this stage, the client and the server have a shared key. The question is, what should the client do to verify that the server is indeed the server that the client expects it is talking with? Check all of the choices that are necessary to verify this. So the answer is the first two. The first one is checking the signature. We're checking the signature here by decrypting using the public key. That verifies that this message was created by someone who knows the private key. So we verified the signature. And you might think that would be enough. We verified the signature, we obtained the public key, and we obtained the value that we need to produce our Diffie-Hellman key. The reason that's not enough is because we're also worried about replay attacks. And that's why we need to do the second check. We're going to recompute this hash. Note that the hash is one way. We can't use the hash to learn the key, but we can compute the key like this for the client, and then check that the key in the hash matches that by computing the hash. We know that there's no replay attack because these values are fresh. If there was a replay attack and a different hash value was replayed, well, then this hash wouldn't match. So we need both of those. The third check doesn't make sense, and this uses YC as well as XS, which is the secret value of the server. If that was revealed, that would break the protocol. So the next question is, how well does this actually work for providing our goal of authenticating the server to the client in cases where the client does not know this public key value before the protocol? We note that in this step, the server sends the public key to the client, and that's the key that's used to verify the signature. So here are the possible answers. Think about what we actually get from this protocol. So the best answer is that it does not provide any authentication. It does establish a shared key, but it's a shared key with some unknown entity. So it's maybe really providing no benefit. But I would say that at least establishing the shared key means now you've got a channel with some entity that's encrypted, and if someone is eavesdropping on that channel, so if you're only worried about a passive adversary, they might be able to eavesdrop on that channel, but you do have a secure key established. You don't know that it's with the right server. If there's an active adversary, this definitely provides no benefit because the active adversary can do the attack in the middle, impersonate the server, establish the key, and that's the one who has the shared key instead of the server that you intend to talk to. If it's a passive adversary, well, that assumes the message actually does get to the right place, so it provides some security against a passive adversary who can't intercept or inject new messages, allows you to establish that key, but doesn't provide any authentication. So I think the third answer is the best. One could make arguments for either the second or the fourth, so don't be upset if you had good arguments for those. And I should emphasize that this establishes a secure shared key only against a passive adversary, even without worrying about the authentication, since an active adversary can interfere with a key that's established. So for this protocol to provide a meaningful benefit, it's necessary that the client actually knows this KUS value or has a way to check it before accepting that this is the server that she intends to talk with. So let me show you how that actually works when we use SSH. And here I'm using SSH to log into Udacity.com. And what I see is a message that says the authenticity of the host can't be established. That means I don't already know a public key for the host. And we can see, because I don't already have a public key for Udacity.com, that it cannot establish the authenticity of the host. It's showing me this fingerprint, which is a way for it to be more easy for a human to view the key rather than seeing all the bits in the key. If I was very paranoid and careful, what I would do is call up an administrator that I trust at Udacity and say, is this the fingerprint for our public key? If I'm less paranoid or more impatient, well, then I could connect. And once I connect, that public key is going to be stored. It's added to the list of hosts that I have. I'm not going to actually continue connecting, but now I have a secure channel encrypted with some key that's been agreed to using this SSH protocol to send my password to the Udacity host, knowing that it couldn't be intercepted. But this only has value if I really knew that this was the public key. Otherwise, I could be talking to anyone. What's happened as a result of this is now that that key has been added to my collection of keys. So now if I look in the file .ssh known hosts, I'll see that I have udacity.com here. And what's been stored is the IP address I was talking to, as well as this is the public key that's stored for udacity.com. If I try again, you'll see that it does connect. It has a secure channel now, and it's verified it by checking that the public key that the server sent match this one. What's more fun is if I modify this file, and I'm going to make a little change to the public key. Let's change that 4 to 3. Now let's try connecting again. What happens now is we get a very large yelling message with lots of capital letters saying that the host identification has changed, that the host I'm trying to connect to sent back a public key that's different from the one that I've stored. It means that someone could be doing something very nasty. In this case, it means that I just modified the key file, and they're talking about possibly being eavesdropped on. It's really not the case that it would be eavesdropping. It must be an attack in the middle. So this is a bit of a poor wording in the error message. It's also possible that the key changed or something else happened. And so they don't allow you to continue with the connection at this point. You could modify the file to create a new key, but it's worried enough that something has gone wrong that it won't let you connect. The next protocol I'm going to talk about is called TLS, which stands for Transport Layer Security. It's also sometimes referred to by its old name, which was SSL, which was Secure Sockets Layer. And this was a protocol that was invented by Netscape in 1995 with the goal of enabling clients, meaning web browsers, and web servers to be able to communicate securely. This is really the essential thing for creating e-commerce. It's the protocol that, among other things, allows people to send credit card numbers over the internet, as well as other personal information, with some confidence that it's going only to the intended destination. It consists of two main parts. The first is the handshake protocol, and that's used to authenticate a server to a client. It can be in both directions. It can also be used to authenticate clients to servers. The way it's used on the web, this rarely happens. This would require clients to have public keys that would be known to the servers. The other outcomes of the handshake protocol are agreement on the cryptographic protocols to use. TLS is a very complex protocol that allows many different encryption algorithms to be used for different parts of it. Part of the handshake is to agree on which ones to use. And the final thing is the essential outcome for communication, to establish a shared session key, a key shared between the server and the client. The second part of the TLS protocol is the TLS record protocol. That's done after the handshake to enable secure communication between the client and the server using the session key that they established from the handshake. The question for this quiz is which one of these two protocols is likely to involve asymmetric cryptography? I haven't described the protocols yet, but based on what they do, you should be able to figure out which one is likely to use asymmetric cryptography. The answer is the handshake protocol. That needs to use asymmetric cryptography to do authentication. If we want to do authentication without starting from a shared key, which if we're talking about a web browser and a client we don't have, that always requires some kind of asymmetric cryptography. So that's what the handshake protocol uses. It uses a combination of asymmetric and symmetric crypto. The record protocol only uses symmetric encryption. The reason for that is that we've established a session key by the end of the handshake. Now we can use symmetric encryption, which is much faster for encrypting all the content of pages. And TLS can be implemented on top of many other protocols. The most commonly used implementation is when it's implemented on top of HTTP, which is the Hypertext Transfer Protocol. This is the key protocol for the web. When you combine TLS with HTTP, what you get is HTTPS, which is rather awkwardly an acronym for Hypertext Transfer Protocol Secure. First, we're going to look at a protocol that's not quite TLS. This will give you a basic idea of how TLS works, but there's some vulnerabilities in the protocol, which we'll talk about fixing next. So here's our client, which is typically a web browser, and our server, which is the web server. The first step in the protocol is the client connects to server, sending a message hello without the exclamation point. It also sends information about what ciphers it is able to use. Different versions of browsers will have different ciphers implemented. The server and the client need to agree on a particular server. The client will also send a list of the ciphers and the hash functions that it has implemented. Different browsers will have different ciphers implemented. It's up to the client and the server to agree on the one to use. In the second step, the server responds. That response includes several things. It will pick the cipher and the hash function to use. Those will be selected from the list that the client sent based on the ones the server can use. And it should pick the strongest ones that are acceptable to both. It also sends a certificate. And what that certificate is something that gives the public key of the server to the client in a way that the client can trust it. And so what's in the certificate is the domain, the name of the server, as well as its public key. There's some other information like expiration times that these certificates expire. And the important thing about the certificate is that it's signed by a certificate authority. We'll talk more about certificates later, but the important thing the certificate does is gives the client access to the server's public key in a way that the client can trust it. The next step is for the client to verify the certificate. Since the certificate is signed by the private key of some certificate authority, that means the client needs the corresponding public key to verify the signature. The client also extracts the public key from that certificate. The next thing the client will do is select a random number, some random value that will be used to generate the session key. So in the third step, the client wants to send back that random value to the server, but in a way that's secure. Let's make that a quiz to see if you can figure out how to do that. So the question is, how should the client securely send the random value to the server? Check the best answer from the list below. The answer is the third choice, that the client should send the random value encrypted using the server's public key. Both of the first two options assume that the client and server already share a symmetric key. If this was the case, well, they wouldn't need this whole protocol. They could use that symmetric key right away to start communicating. And the fact that they're able to communicate using that key verifies that they have authenticated each other. This solution does not work well for web applications. There's no way for me to easily establish a shared symmetric key with Amazon before the protocol begins. The fourth choice would be useful for integrity. If the server knew the client's public key, then it could verify that this random value came from the client, but this would expose the random value to anyone else who intercepted the message and also knows the client's public key. And it provides no authentication that the server is who the client expects. So the right answer is the third one, that we want to send the random value encrypted so it can't be intercepted, but that it can be decrypted by the server, and the server has the corresponding private key to decrypt this. Now, once the server receives this message, it can decrypt it using its private key. We'll use the value of R as a session key. And after this, both the client and the server have the shared session key and can communicate. Now we have a secure channel between the client and the server, encrypted with the symmetric key K. So now I want to ask a few questions about this protocol to see that you can understand some of the things that could go wrong with this simplified version of TLS. So here's some possibilities, and keep in mind the threat model that we introduced earlier. We're assuming an active attacker with limited computational power. Check all of the things that we should be worried about going wrong the way the protocol is specified here. So I think the best answer is the first two, but not the third. Whether the first could happen depends on what we mean by hijacking a session. So an attacker in the middle could certainly replace this with some other message. Instead of sending the R value selected by the client, sending some other value. And that would make the server pick some different key. And then the messages the server sends would be encrypted with that key. That means the attacker could pick an R prime value that the attacker knows and decrypt the messages from the server. It wouldn't allow the attacker to hijack the entire session though, because the client messages would still be encrypted with K, not known to the attacker based on this R value. And the attacker doesn't have a way to decrypt this, just a way to change the key the server picks. But that's a pretty serious problem if the server is sending messages that the attacker can intercept and decrypt. So this is a problem, and what we'd like to do is change it so the key incorporates more values that couldn't be interfered with by the attacker. We'll talk about how to do that next. First, let me talk about the other answer that's true, that the attacker could easily force the client and server to use a different cipher. So in step 2, the server responds with the selected cipher and hash. This is an unencrypted message. An attacker who intercepts it could change these ciphers to something weaker. If the client supports the weaker cipher, the client has no way to know that the server supports a stronger cipher and will settle for the weaker one selected by the attacker. We'll look at how to fix both of these problems next. The challenge is we need to fix them where these steps in the protocol don't have a shared secret yet. We need to agree on the cipher and the hash function before we actually establish the shared key. So these are two pretty fundamental problems. So that's not going to work. So we need to make some improvements here. So the way to solve this problem is to include more randomness in the key here. So an attacker who can replace this won't be able to trick the parties into agreeing to a different key, and then they can verify that they've agreed on the same key. So what we're going to do is add extra random nonces to these steps. So in addition to the messages here, The client will generate a random value, we'll call that RC, that will be added to this message. The server will generate a random value RS that will be added to this message. This value will still be created. This is what's called the pre-master secret. What we're going to send here is going to include a little extra information. It's still going to include R, the pre-master secret. We need to share that with the server. We're going to pad this. This will make search attacks more difficult, prevent some of the weaknesses if this is a message happens to be a small number. So we're going to use the PKCS protocol that we talked about in Unit 4 to use RSA more securely. If this were some other cipher, we could use a different way of padding it. We're also going to add to R something about the client version, and this will be useful for verifying that the previous steps have not been tampered with. So now, instead of making the key just R, the key is going to combine all of the randomness that we've used so far. So the way we'll compute the key, which is now called the master secret, is by using a pseudo-random function. This is like a hash function, where what it takes as inputs are the pre-master secret, that's R, and it also takes a label, which is just identifying this as the master secret, which gets combined with the value of RC, the client's randomness, and the value of RS, the server's randomness. And what H is a way of using a combination of hash functions where it takes a key as well as the value that you're hashing. What it produces is 384 bits, which gets divided into three 128-bit keys. One of these will be used as the key for symmetric encryption, and that's using an algorithm like RC4 typically. One of these will become the IV, and that's the initialization vector that we need for CBC, cipher block chaining mode, that we'll use. We'll talk about the protocol, how it uses that later. And the other one would be a key that's used for a keyed hash. We previously talked about hash functions that didn't use a key. The important property of the hash function is it gives us a one-way mapping. A keyed hash function, that mapping depends on the key. One way to think about that, which is not quite the way these work, but it's really concatenating that key with the value we're hashing. If it's a strong cryptographic hash function, that should be effectively equivalent to a keyed hash function. So this change means if an active attacker can interfere with this message, they still can't control what gets computed here. This depends on randomness used in the previous two steps. And what happens before the channel is used for anything secure is the client and the server need to verify that they got the same key. So we add a step here to finish the handshake. And the way that step works is we encrypt the finished message using the key extracted from the master secret. That means if any of these values were tampered with, that key would be different. The handshake would never be finished, and there would never be any secure communication sent using that key because both parties verify the handshake before continuing. So this fixes the first problem. Now there's no way for the middle attacker to hijack the session. If they tamper with this message, it will be detected when the final step, when the handshake finish is done using a key that depended on all these values. Depending on the random values here also prevents replay attacks. Since new random values are used for each protocol execution, there's no way to replay it. The key depends on these values that were used previously. So the second problem, the decision about what ciphers and hash functions to use, is based on these clear text messages. So an attacker who tampers with these could make the client and server use some very weak cipher and then be able to break messages encrypted with that cipher. This was really a problem because US export control laws meant that some of these ciphers were very weak. It was necessary to support ciphers that used only a 40-bit key to satisfy US laws. That meant the encryption was weak enough that it could easily be broken by brute force. The solution to this is to make sure that these messages are also authenticated. That can't be done at the beginning because there's no key established yet, but that can be done at later steps. So let's recap the TLS handshake. There's an important part of it that we haven't focused on yet. The first step is the hello from the client to server. The second step, the server responds. Both of these messages include new randomness, and part of this response is a certificate. And then in the third step, the client sends a new random value encrypted with the server's public key. And at the end of this process, the client and the server have agreed on a master secret, which is used to derive the keys for communication. So the key question and the goal of the protocol is for the client to know that it's communicating with the correct server and that that master secret is only shared with the server it intends to communicate. So the question is, how can the client trust that it's communicating with the server it intends to communicate with? Here are the choices. Select the best answer. And I should warn you, this is a bit of an unfair question since we haven't talked about this yet, but I think you know enough to figure out the answer based on what you've seen so far. The correct answer is the third choice. What the client needs to do to know that it's talking with the correct server, it needs to know that it's talking with server S and knows that that's a public key owned by S. So if that's correct, then S owns the corresponding private key, and only that server can decrypt this message and obtain the right session key. So this is the problem the certificate is designed to solve. Number one would work if we had a way to always know the public key beforehand. That would be great. We wouldn't need any other solution. This is not going to work for websites. This would only work if we could preload the public key of all the websites we might ever communicate with into the browser. That's not realistic. We need some other way of getting new public keys for new sites as we visit them. Verifying the certificate using KUS doesn't make any sense because KUS was provided by the server. So if we used the server's public key to verify the certificate, that would be a self-signed certificate. It wouldn't prove anything since the signature is being verified with a key provided by the person claiming the signature. That's why we need the third solution, which uses some other key that the client already trusts to verify the certificate, and then the information in the certificate to know that it's the right server and to know the server's public key. So before looking at how that works, I want to demonstrate what happens when we connect using TLS in the browser. And different browsers deal with TLS in different ways. If we connect to https google.com, well, that's using SSL to connect. We can see in the address bar, it's indicating that it's a secure connection. If we click on that, we can see more information about that. We're connected to the site google.com, unknown who it's run by, and it's verified by a certificate provided by Thawat Consulting Limited. And we can click on this to get more information about that key. This has information about the certificate, and we can click on the certificate to see what it was. It says our communication between the site is now being encrypted. As a result of the handshake protocol, the client and the server have agreed on a key, and now all the messages between our client and the server are encrypted using that key. If we look at the certificate, well, we see more information about how that was established. And we have an SSL server certificate. It indicates who it was issued to. So it was issued to www.google.com. That matches the name of the site we connected to. And it explains who issued the certificate. And it has fingerprints for the certificate. We can also see that it has an expiration date. Certificates don't last forever. That's an important property. If the certificate lasted forever, we'd have to have a very strong encryption on it. By making it expire, the key lengths needed for the certificate can be predicted based on expected computing power until the expiration time. We can see more if we look at the details. And this is where we get into the real issue of how the certificates work, that there's a chain of authorities that validate the certificate. And we'll talk about that more soon and then look at this again. So what we need in the certificate is something that communicates the public key of the server to the client in a way that the client can trust. So here's one way to do that. We'll make the certificate include the name of the domain and its public key. And let's assume we're using RSA, so this would be an RSA key. That's the public key, and that means the server knows the corresponding private key. This is encrypted using a private key of some certificate authority that the client has to trust. So the question is, how should the client verify the certificate? Here are the possible answers. Select the best one. The answer is the second one. The first one doesn't make sense since there's nothing to match KUS against. This is what the certificate is protecting. It's ensuring that the client learns the right public key for the server. The second one is our goal, that we want to know that the certificate matches the domain that we're connecting with. And then we can trust that that's actually a public key associated with that domain. The other two could possibly work, but they would require an extra round of communication. They'd require the certificate authority being online. And if we could obtain the key directly from the certificate authority, well, we wouldn't need this step. We'd talk to them in the first place. The appeal of sending the certificate is we don't need the certificate authority to be online or add an extra communication to another place when we connect to the server. The server can store its own certificate and send it to clients when they need it. So now let's look more closely at what's actually in a certificate, and we can double click in our browser. Depending on the browser, you're either clicking on a key or clicking on the name. And we can see that our certificate is telling us we're connected to google.com and the connection's encrypted. When we look at more information, we can see more about the certificate and we can view the certificate. So let's look at the details of the certificate, and we can see many things here. We'll look at several of them. So the first is the hierarchy, and we'll talk about that later. That's what gives us confidence in the certificate. So let's look more closely at what's in the certificate, and I've zoomed the window to make it easier to see. So we have the fields of the certificate are the contents. So we can see it's got a version. It's got an issuer. The issuer indicates who issued the certificate, in this case, Thwat, which is now owned by VeriSign. It's got an expiration time. It's got the time it was valid from until the time it was valid to. Then it has the subject, which gives us the name of the owner of the certificate, which is google.com. And then we can see the public key information. So it says the algorithm the public key is, which is using RSA encryption. And we talked about PKCS in Unit 4. That's a way of padding to provide security when using RSA. And we can see the public key. We can see the modulus is 1024 bits. That's long enough to be secure with the recommended RSA key sizes today. And then we can see the exponent, and we see that it's a small exponent. This is a popular exponent. Many keys use this. And we talked about when we looked at RSA that it's okay that the public key has a small exponent. What we need is to know that the exponent for the secret key is hard to determine, and so that must be a large number. But the public key can have a small exponent. So we've seen some parts of the certificate. Just to make sure everyone's paying attention, have we seen anything convincing yet in what we've seen of the certificate so far? The answer is no. Everything we've seen so far, any attacker could have generated. If our communication was actually being intercepted, an attacker could generate a certificate that says all these things, but instead of having Google's real public key, would have a public key generated by the attacker. So just looking at this provides no value yet. What we need is a signature. So that's the important part of the key. We can see that the certificate was signed using a signature algorithm. This is PKCS number 1, using RSA encryption. So that's the padding scheme we talked about in Unit 4. And SHA-1 is the hash function. And then we can see the value of the certificate. And this is it. So we have 1024 bits. And this is what we need to use to convince ourselves that this is a valid certificate. Of course, this is actually work that the browser's doing. So we're really trusting the browser to implement this checking correctly. So what is in the signature? It's the result of encrypting the hash of the certificate contents using the private key of the issuer. And the signature algorithm tells us what we're using for the encryption and the hashing functions. And both of these are popular but perhaps somewhat questionable choices. SHA-1 is known to have some weaknesses that may make it possible for attackers to find hash collisions. So for this quiz, I want you to decide whether or not the certificate contents that's used as the input to the hash here should include the signature itself. The answer is no, that it's not possible to include the signature in the hash itself. And the reason for this is if that was included, well, we don't know what it is until we've computed this. And after we compute this, well, if we computed it again with the new result, well, that would change it every time. So unless we had a very weak hash function and a very weak encryption function, there's no way to sensibly include the signature in this contents. But the good news is we don't need to. The reason we don't need to is this is what we're using to verify the rest of the certificate. The important part is that it's encrypted using the private key of the issuer. So in order to trust the certificate, the client needs to validate that signature. To do that, it needs to know the corresponding public key. It needs to know that public key that can be used to decrypt this message. And if it decrypts it, it can check that this hash value is the same as what it computes when it hashes the certificate content itself. So that's the real problem that public key infrastructure needs to solve. We need ways of distributing these public keys. And that's called public key infrastructure, also known as PKI. We need a way to securely know the public key of the issuer. Once we know that, well, we can use the certificate to learn the public key of the website we visited. So how do we know that public key? So let's look back at the certificate that we got from Google. And what we see at the top of it is the certificate hierarchy. We see that we have the google.com certificate, and that's the one that we looked at and saw that it had this public key. And that was signed by an issuer, and that issuer is Thwat. And we can click on that, and now we can see the certificate from Thwat that was used to sign this certificate. So we have the certificate from Thwat. It was issued by VeriSign. We can check that it's valid. It's valid to 2014. And that certificate also has a public key. So it's got a subject identifying Thwat Consulting that generated the key. And it's got a public key. It's also an RSA key with PKCS. And we can see that public key. So that's the public key that we can use to validate the certificate that RSA provided. We can use that to decrypt the signed hash to validate that certificate. This would only be useful if we knew that we could trust this public key. So how do we trust this public key? Well, it's got a certificate, and its certificate was issued by VeriSign. We can find VeriSign's public key to verify this one. So that's the top of the certificate hierarchy here, that we have a certificate from VeriSign. And if we look at that one, well, it came from VeriSign, and it's got a public key, also an RSA key, and this one. You'll notice all of them use 65,537 as their exponent. The moduluses are different. If they weren't different, that would mean they're all using the same public key, which would be a pretty serious problem. And if we look at this key, we can see its expiration date is all the way up to 2028. It goes back to 1996. So this is a very long-lived key, and this is the key that is the root of our certificate hierarchy. So here's what we have. We have a certificate that was sent by Google. It was signed using a private key owned by Thwat Consulting. So to validate that, we need the corresponding public key, which we get from a certificate that was signed by VeriSign. To verify that, we need the public key for VeriSign. And we have that from a certificate, which says it's VeriSign's. So how can we trust VeriSign's certificate? Or do we have to keep going on forever? I'm going to claim that the answer is the third one. You could certainly argue that there's a better case for the first one, but that would be pretty disappointing. The reason that we trust this key is not because it's signed by VeriSign. And in fact, it actually is signed by VeriSign. When we look at that certificate, we see that it is signed. It was issued by VeriSign, and it does have a certificate signature. And we could verify it against this public key. But that would be verifying it against the same key that the certificate describes. That's what's called a self-signed certificate. Well, this doesn't convince you of anything. Anyone could generate a certificate like that. In fact, you can do that. You can generate one yourself. If you're using a Mac, you have OpenSSL built in, and you use that to generate your own self-signed certificate. But it doesn't prove anything. So the best answer here is that, well, we trust it because we got it from some trusted source, and we protected it, and we know that it's valid. How that works in a web browser is there's a set of certificates that are built in. You can download more, but you have to be careful if you download them. You need to know that they're secure. If you look in your browser settings, you can see all the certificates that are built in. And there's actually quite a lot of them. Not all these were always built in, so all the ones that are listed as built in were built in. They came with the browser, and we can see that there is one for VeriSign, actually several for VeriSign, that were built in. And these are trusted only because we think we got the browser from a trusted source and it had these certificates built in. We can look at one of these certificates. You'll notice that they're rated as different classes. What it means is mostly that someone was willing to pay more to VeriSign to get a higher class certificate. If you pay more, they do a little more identity checking to say that you're probably the one who's asking for the certificate. But all the certificate proves is that VeriSign granted it to you and decided that the person that they granted a certificate that said I'm google.com probably had some affiliation with Google. The higher the class, the more you have to pay, and the more work VeriSign does to validate that. So if we look at one of these certificates, we can see the root certificate that's built in. This is the root of trust. We're trusting this because it came in the browser. And you'll notice that these have quite long expiration dates. Since these are used to sign all these other certificates, if they expire, all the certificates they signed would break. And that raises the question of what happens when there's a bad certificate. And there have been several well-publicized incidents where VeriSign or other certificate authorities accidentally granted a certificate to someone who wasn't actually representing the company that they asked for a certificate from. Revocation lists are one way to deal with that you can have a list of, well, these are signed certificates that aren't actually valid. If those are kept up to date and the browser always checks them, well, then you could have a certificate be revoked even though it was signed. This is a pretty painful solution to this problem, though. It requires always updating this list. It means that the time between the update, you're vulnerable if there's a bad certificate, and requires a lot of extra work for the browser to validate a certificate. The best solution, of course, would be never to grant a certificate without validating that identity. So these chains can be arbitrarily long, as long as all the keys along the chain are consistent and chained together in the right way. As long as we start with a root that we trust already, we can validate certificates signed by any of the parties along the chain. And now we could, in theory, use Google to validate a new certificate and add another layer to the chain. So what I want to do in the forum is encourage some open discussion, encourage you to find interesting certificate chains on the web, see what the longest one you can find is, and post those in the forum, as well as any interesting things you find along these paths. So here's the essence of the TLS handshake. To recap, the client initiates with the server. We're leaving out all the details about selecting the ciphers and the extra randomness, which is important for security. The server sends back a certificate. The client validates the certificate using a chain of certificates going back to some root certificate that the client trusts, selects a random R, and then encrypts that using the public key of the server. The server can decrypt it because it knows the corresponding private key, and then they finish the handshake. So now the client and server can communicate using those shared symmetric keys. And the protocol to do that is the TLS record protocol. I may have made the misimpression earlier that once you've established symmetric keys, communication is easy and there's nothing left to work out. That's not the case. So we're going to look at the TLS protocol next, and indeed it does have some vulnerabilities. So at the end of the TLS handshake protocol, the server and the client have agreed on 3 keys, which they've extracted from the master secret, a key for a symmetric encryption function, an initialization vector for that encryption, and a key for a hash function. The goal now is to protect the traffic between the server and the client, and this will be in the form of requests for web pages. And a typical HTTP request is to get some web page, and then the server will send a response. And I should reiterate that TLS protects many kinds of traffic. The protocol is not specific to HTTP. What I'm really talking about here is HTTPS, but the record protocol is the same regardless of how we're actually requesting the traffic. And so this response is the contents of some web page, which can be quite long. This could be many kilobytes of data. So we need a way to encrypt that response and send it back to the client. So the responses we'll call M. We want both confidentiality and integrity checking. So we're also going to include a MAC. So we'll compute a MAC using the hash function. So that's going to be the HMAC of M. And this uses KH to key the hash function for HMAC. This is similar to what we talked about in Unit 2, where we're hashing the message. But because it's a keyed hash function, it depends on the key as well. And finally, we're going to have some padding to fill up the block size. Now we want to send this whole response, the result of concatenating all of these, over the secure channel. And we'll call this R. The way this is done with the TLS record protocol is to use CBC, that's cipher block chaining mode of operation, and some encryption function. We talked about CBC mode in Unit 2. As a reminder, this is the way CBC works. So there's an initialization vector. So we break the message into blocks. So I'll call those blocks M0, M1, up to M and minus 1. The first message block is XORed with initialization vector. The output of that is encrypted using a key. And the key that's used is a key that resulted from the handshake protocol. This results in the first ciphertext block. And that becomes the input to the next XOR. So that's the way the first response is done. But in a session, there might be multiple responses. So when the next response is done, we don't want to do the whole handshake protocol again. So what happens in the next response, whatever the next message block is, so that's going to be M'0, will be encrypted using CBC mode again. That will produce the ciphertext block at the beginning of the next message. What we need is an IV here. We don't want to use the same IV again. That would make it clear if M0 equals M0 prime. So the approach that is taken by TLS is to use the last ciphertext block of the previous message as the IV for the first block of the next message. So this effectively makes it seem like it's one long message. It seems like this is a good idea, and it's certainly better than reusing the original IV, and it's better than having to do the handshake protocol all over again. The handshake's quite expensive. It involves asymmetric cryptographic operations, which are very expensive compared to the symmetric ones we're using here. But this method does raise an interesting vulnerability. Let's see if you can figure out what it is using a quiz. So the question is, suppose an adversary intercepts the first message. So the adversary learns all the encrypted blocks, doesn't learn anything else, doesn't know the K value or the IV value. The handshake worked fine. And the question is whether the adversary can learn whether some block is equal to some guess for that block. To make this more concrete, suppose the blocks are all 8 bits. The adversaries intercepted all the ciphertext blocks, but I'll only tell you 3 of them. C3 was 10, 10, 10, 10, 10. C4 was 0, 0, 0. Cn-1, that's the last ciphertext block, was 4 ones followed by 4 zeros. And what the adversary wants to learn is if the value of M4 was equal to all zeros. And to do this, the adversary can set the value of M0 prime, figure out how to make the server give a particular response, and examine the first ciphertext block. So the answer is 0101 1010. Let me explain why. So remember that we're using CBC mode encryption. The value of ciphertext block I is the result of encrypting using the key. The value of ciphertext block I-1 XORed with message block I. For the first block of the second message, well, that's going to be C0 prime. It's the result of encrypting the value of the previous block, and this was the initialization vector for the first block. For this one, it's the last block in the previous message. So that was the block we called Cn-1, and that's XORed with message block 0. So here's the danger. The adversary actually knows this value. So that means the adversary can pick a message value, so the value of C0 prime reveals something. That means it has to be an input to the encryption. We're assuming the adversary can't break the encryption. But it has to be an input to the encryption that the adversary already knows what the expected result is. So the adversary knows the encryptions of all the blocks in the previous message, and we know from the way CBC worked, if we want to learn the value of M4, well, M4 was encrypted in the original message using the value here. This was ciphertext 3, the previous ciphertext block, and that was encrypted, and it produces output ciphertext block 4. So that means if we can feed in to this result, that means if we can make the value of this equal to the result of C3 XORed with M4, well, we don't know M4, but we can make it our guess for M4. So we're going to XOR it with our guess for M star, M4. If that's the input to the encryption function, well, then we'll be able to look at the output and see if it matches C4. So to make that the input, well, we have this IV, which is really the last block in the previous message. Well, we can just XOR that out. So what we're going to pass in is the guess XORed with the known value of C3, XORed with this value. With the values I've chosen, well, C3 is this. M star is all 0, so we don't need to worry about that in the XOR. And Cn-1, the last ciphertext block, is all the 1s. So that's going to flip the first 4 bits. That's why we get this value. And let's see what happens when that value is used for M0. What we're going to get for ciphertext block 0 is the result of encrypting the known value of ciphertext block n-1 with this result, which is C3. Well, now this is XOR, so that same values cancel out. And so that means the result is the result of encrypting C3, XOR with M star. Well, that's the same as we were doing here, right? That's encrypting M4, XORed with C3. We know what C3 is, so we could construct this message to pass in. We don't know what M4 is, but we know if this result is the same, well, then this should be the same as ciphertext block 4. And that would give us the answer to the question, was M4 equal to M star? And of course, we can generalize this. If we can pick the value of M0 prime to be the XOR of the last ciphertext block and the one before the one we want to guess, and our guess, that means what we learn, if the ciphertext block that results from the new message is equal to ciphertext block I, then we know that block MI is equal to M star. So how serious is this attack? Well, if the block size is small, we could guess all of these blocks. Turns out that the block size isn't that small. The parameters we saw were using RC4. RC4 is a symmetric encryption algorithm. It at least loosely stands for Ron's code 4. That's not what it officially stands for. but that's what most people think of it as, and this is Ron Rivest, the R in RSA, who invented this symmetric encryption algorithm that's known as RC4. And the block size is typically used in TLS is 64 bits. TLS could also be using AES with a block size of 128 bits. So that would mean the attack is only useful if the attacker can guess those 64 bits in a useful way and has a way to control the message. That seems like it might not be much of a threat, and this attack was actually known. It was identified by Gregory Bard in 2004 and viewed as not too serious of a problem with TLS because it does give an attacker an advantage, but these blocks are big enough that the ability to do this, and if you can only guess one more message, if you can only control the server, well, you don't have too much power. And it assumes a quite powerful attacker that has an ability to control the messages the server is going to send. Well, it turns out that there are very serious implications of this attack. They depend on being able to inject JavaScript code. So there are ways that an attacker might be able to control the responses. And using JavaScript requests, if the attacker controls JavaScript on the page that the victim is using TLS to request, well, that JavaScript can make repeated requests over to the server. Those are still going to be part of the encrypted session, but the attacker can control what those requests are and perhaps can design requests that the server will respond to in a particular way, giving the attacker control over the first block in the next message. The other thing the attacker could do is figure out a way to know many of the bits. So suppose the attacker knows 58 bits and there's 1 byte, but that byte contains 1 character of an authentication token. That could be part of a cookie, say. And it turns out that there is an attack that exploits this. It has the rather clever acronym BEAST, Browser Exploit Against SSL TLS. And this found ways to use this cryptographic weakness. And it turns out if you can inject JavaScript into the page, you can control these requests enough to actually use this. And this was demonstrated quite recently in 2011, showing a way that you could use this and this technique of controlling many of the bits in the first block to break an authentication token for a PayPal cookie. So this is quite a powerful attack. If you only need to guess 8 bits at a time, you expect to only need 128 guesses for each byte. So I want to talk about one more vulnerability in TLS, and that's an information leak. So now we'll assume that the encryption works fine, the handshake is good, all of these messages are encrypted, but the attacker can listen in on this channel. So assuming the attacker can't break any of the encryption, but can observe the messages on this channel, what does the attacker learn? The answer is many, many things that we should be worried about. The attacker might not learn the exact size because of padding on the requests up to the block size. The same thing for the responses. The attacker also learns the pattern, and this reveals a lot about a web page. Because of optimizations in HTTP, there are often multiple responses to one request. This could be because a large page is broken into many responses. It could be because there are many images on the page and they get responded, and although they would normally require separate requests, because of caching, they could be sent before those requests. So these patterns are very distinguishing. Different web pages will have different sizes of responses as well as a different pattern. An example of where this is particularly dangerous in modern web applications. So we're using HTTPS connected to Google. And now when I type a letter, I get a response. It's filling up the guesses of what I'm going to type next. The size of this response depends on the letter that I typed. If I type another letter, will I get a different response? You can see that Udacity is the most popular word starting with UD, at least according to when I'm using Google. I don't know if that's true for everyone. But that size differs, and if I type another letter, will I get a different response? And so the size of these responses depend on the letters I'm typing. The length of these words will affect the size of the response. And you can build a model that would identify what someone's typing based on the sizes of these responses. And there's a paper by a group from Microsoft Research that shows some of these vulnerabilities and how much information an attacker can learn from that. There's another paper by Peter Chapman and myself, and you may remember Peter if you took CS 101, he was the TA for that looked at ways of measuring this and understanding how much information is really leaking. So this is a serious attack. It's something that even though the encryption is there, that an attacker can learn a lot about what's going on a web page. So this brings us to the conclusion of Unit 5. We've seen several examples of authentication protocols and focused on TLS as the most widely used protocol that's used for every secure web session. So the first thing I hope you take away from this is that designing cryptographic protocols is really hard. The details matter, and the way things are implemented matters. TLS is a protocol that's built on SSL that's been around for over 17 years, still has new vulnerabilities being discovered, and people learning new ways to exploit them. The other key lesson is attacks get better, they never get worse. Even if the initial attack seems to be only theoretical and not be easy to exploit, there are often ways that clever people will figure out ways to exploit those attacks. In Unit 6, we'll look at other things you can do with cryptographic protocols. This unit focused all on authentication and communication, but there are lots and lots of other things we can do with cryptography. Some of those are quite interesting, and I hope you'll be back for Unit 6 to learn about them.
For this question, we're to discuss threat models and the one-time pad from Unit 1. In order to know that a one-time pad provides confidentiality, which of these do we need to assume about the adversary? Is it necessary that an attacker has limited computational power? Is it necessary that the attacker doesn't know anything about the key? Or is it necessary that the attacker cannot modify the message? Check all that apply. The only one that is necessary is the second one, that the attacker doesn't know anything about the key. A one-time pad is a perfect cipher, and as a perfect cipher, the computation power of the adversary is irrelevant, so the first one is not true. The second statement is true because if an attacker knows something about the key, she or he will know something about the message, which would compromise the confidentiality. It is not necessary to assume that the attacker cannot modify the message. Modifying the message only affects the integrity of the message, but that does not affect the confidentiality. One weakness of the encrypted key exchange is that passwords have to be stored. One possible improvement would be to encrypt using a hash of the password instead of the password itself. In the first step, the client sends some identifying information along with the first part of the key exchange, but this time it's encrypted with the hash of P. And likewise, in the second step, the server response is encrypted with the hash of P instead of P. And so we want to know, does this work? And the options are, yes, it provides further protection against a dictionary attack. Yes, but it doesn't provide much advantage since now an attacker who learns the hash of P doesn't need to learn P. No, it prevents the client and server from establishing a shared key since the server can't invert the hash. Or no, it has a serious security vulnerability. Answer is yes, but it doesn't provide much advantage since now an attacker who learns the hash of P doesn't need to learn P. The first statement is not true. If there was some dictionary attack using the password, it would work just as well using the hash of the password. The third one is also not true. The server doesn't need to invert the hash and a shared key can be established just like before. And the fourth one is not true. If there was a serious security vulnerability in this protocol, it would exist in the original protocol as well. For this problem, you're given 6 certificates, and the question is which ones would be useful to connect to Udacity.com. Assume that we know KUCA, the public key of the certificate authority, and for notation, H is a hash function, and E is RSA encryption. Check all that are useful to establish a secure session. Of these options, the third one, the fourth one, and the sixth one are useful. In the first one, the public key for Udacity is inside of the hash, and so we have no way of actually getting that, and so that's not useful. For the second one, the encryption is done using Udacity's private key, and so this is a self-signed certificate, which is not very useful for us. The fifth one is not useful because the hostname, Udacity.com, is not bound with the key. We would need to include that in the inputs to the encryption. The third and fourth ones are useful. We have our hostname, we have our public key, and both of these are inside the encryption. For the sixth option, this is a certificate chain. We have from the certificate authority the public key of TrustyCerts, and then TrustyCerts signs the public key of Udacity and binds it to Udacity.com. This question asks, why do most signing schemes use the signature of M equals M concatenated with the encryption of the hash function of M instead of the signature of M equals the encryption of M concatenated with a nonce? And the options are because hashing M provides more security, to improve efficiency, to make it so that it is not necessary to perform asymmetric decryption to validate a certificate, or to provide resistance to small message space attacks. And the answer is to improve efficiency. If the message M is very long, RSA could be a very expensive operation, and so we only want to run the encryption on the hash of the message, which will be smaller. The first option is not true. The security of this scheme depends on the encryption function, not on the hash function. The third option is not true. Asymmetric decryption is necessary in both schemes. The fourth option is not true because we haven't done anything to increase the message space.